Hello everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. Now I'm going to read Crandford, final chapter 9, A Happy Return. Mrs. Jamieson, when she returned, considered Miss Mary's situation for 2 or 3 days. Then she kindly gave her approval and allowed Miss Mary to sell tea and stay remain in Crandford society, although she would be in trade. I think she was trying to annoy Lady Glanmere by showing that a married woman comes down to her husband level in society. And a married woman like Miss Mary, however, could keep the level that her father had. So Crandford was allowed to visit Miss Mary, and whether allowed or not, it was going to visit Lady Glanmere. But then we learned that Mr. and Mrs. Hawkins were going to return the following week. Mrs. Hawkins, not Lady Glanmere. Mrs. Jamieson was pleased. That woman never had any taste, she said. But that woman and her new husband looked very happy on Sunday at church, and we did not return our faces away from them as Mrs. Jamieson did. Miss Mary sold a lot of her furniture though, and an old friend, Mrs. Fitzadam, I suspected, bought some favorite pieces back for her. The rector, too, bought the late Mr. Jenkins' library and then offered some of the books back to Miss Mary, saying he had not enough shelves for them all. The downstairs room was changed into a shop, as agreed, and we put a very small notice above the new door. Matilda Jenkins, seller of tea. Inside, the walls were white and two great boxes of tea stood on the bare wooden floor. I spent my small savings on sweets for the children Miss Mary loved so much, and now her shop was ready to open. Well, not quite. Miss Mary was worried because Mr. Johnson also sold tea and she did not want to take business away from him. So she went down the street to talk to him about it. He was very kind to her, and I know that he sent her some of his own customers by telling them that Miss Jenkins's tea were better than the ones he sold. My businessman father shook his head. All very well in Crandford pubs. You could not do business like that in Drumble. But I was delighted. Everyone certainly seemed to need tea. Indeed, Miss Mary sold so much of it on the first 2 days that I felt able to leave her and go home to Drumble. I returned every 3 months to check the shop and help Miss Mary with her business letters. This reminded me, of course, that no reply had ever come from India. I became too ashamed of my letter to the other Jackins and was glad I had told nobody about it. About a year after Miss Mary opened her shop, Mother begged me to come back to Crandford. I went immediately in case Miss Mary was ill. She was not. When I looked quietly into the shop, there she was behind the table, happily knitting. The only problem was that Mother was expecting her first baby very soon, and Miss Mary did not realize it. I'm so afraid she won't approve, cried Mother to me in the kitchen. Will you tell her? I decided I would not. But a week later, I went in to see Miss Mary with a baby in my arms. She asked for her glasses, looked at it in surprise, and was very silent all day. Then she went up to see Mother, and they both cried with happiness. Shy, proud James shook my hand so hard that I still remember the pain. While mother was in bed, I was busy in the house, but sometimes I helped Miss Maddie in the shop and was amused to watch her. She would never make a success of selling sweets. She gave away too many to every children who came in, but she had made more than £20 from selling teas in her first year. I discovered she liked her new life too now that she was used to it. She met the country people and they brought so many little presents of fruit and eggs for the old rector's daughters that her table was sometimes quite full. Crandford itself went on as usual. Mr. and Mrs. Hawkins were very happy together, though Mrs. Jameson's day did not speak to them, and even her man Mulina avoided them in the street. It was now June. Mother was up again, and I was sitting in the shop one afternoon with Miss Maddie when I saw a gentleman walk slowly past the window. He stood at the door searching for a name. Then he came in. His hair was white, but his face was deep brown from the sun. It was the Aga Jackins I noted. He stood opposite Miss Maddie, just looking at her. Then she turned sharply to me. Is your name Mary Smith? Yes, I said. He clearly did not know how to announce himself to Miss Maddie, who was always shy when a man entered the shop. Give me £1 of those things, he said, and waving at some sweets. £1? Now Miss Maddie looked up at him. Oh, sir, can you be Peter? She said and trembled from head to foot. In a moment he was round the table and holding her in his arms. She was so white that I told Mr. Peter to her up to the drawing room and put her on the sofa. I've too saddened for you, my little Maddie, he said. She held her brother's hand tightly and allowed him to carry her up. I left them to talk alone when I went down to tell a delighted mother and then back to the shop. We had tea early that day. Miss Maddie sat in the armchair opposite her brother, eating nothing, just looking at him. You were a boy when you left Crandford, she said fondly, and now you have white hair. And I forgot how time passes, Maddie. I've brought you a pretty little dress from India. I remembered your taste. It was so like my dear mother's. At that name, the brother and sister held each other's hand even more tightly, and I got up to leave them together again. But Peter rose too. I must arrange for a room at the George, he said. My bag is there too. No, cried Miss Maddie. Please, dear Peter, don't go. Mary, don't allow it. So I gave Mr. Peter my room and moved in with Miss Maddie. Poor Peter, she told me that night, had fought at Rangoon and been taken prisoner by the Burmese. Afterwards, his letters to England were returned with the word dead across them, so he had decided to stay out in the East as a planter. Then my letter arrived. I do not think Peter came home from India a rich man, but a day or 2 days later the shop was closed. The sweets were given to children, the tea was given to old people. The pretty dress were kept for Flora Gordon, and at about this time many nice presents arrived from Miss Poole and Mrs. Forrester and Mrs. Fitzadden and Mrs. Jameson. I myself received handsome copies of Dr. Johnson's books. Miss Maddie begged me with tears in her eyes and to consider them present from her sister as well as herself. Peter became a great favorite with the ladies of Crandford. He told wonderful stories, though these stories were less wonderful, I noticed when the rector was present. He had wonderful foreign ways. He even sat on the floor at one of Miss Poole's parties. When Mrs. Jamieson smiled her approval, I remembered she had once called Mr. Hoggin vulgar just because he crossed his legs as he sat on his chair. So I returned to Trample, leaving Miss Mattie and Mr. Peter very happy together. Mother and Jane remained willingly in the house with baby Matilda. The, the only sadness was that Mrs. Jamieson and the Hawkinses were still not friends. But then, one October morning, I received letters from Miss Poole and Miss Mattie asking me to come to Crandford. The dear Gordons were arriving on the 14th. They wrote and had invited everyone to a lunch at the George Inn, even Miss Betty Barker, even Mr. Hoggins and his wife, whom Major Gordon had met in Scotland. Would Mrs. Jamieson go to the lunch? When I arrived in Crandford, no one yet knew. Mr. Peter, however, said she should and would go. Leave Mrs. Jamieson to me, he announced. The next thing we heard from Miss Poole was that Mrs. Jamieson was indeed going. Clever Mr. Peter had arranged for Signor Brunoni, conjurer to the King of Daly, to return to Crandford Assembly Room in honor of the Honorable Mrs. Jamieson. Mrs. Jamieson's name was written large on the notice. Mr. Peter was sending everyone free tickets. And when was Signor Brunoni going to show his magic? On the evening of the Gordon's lunch. So Mrs. Jamieson came to the lunch, all smiles, at Mr. Peter's fantastic story of his troubles, and he entered the assembly room that evening with the Honorable Mrs. Jamieson on one side and my lady Mrs. Hoggins on the other. Since that day, the old friendliness has returned to Crandford. I'm pleased about this. My dear Miss Mattie loves peace and kindness, and I think we all better people when she is near. Finish. Okay, I have already read to finish Crandford all chapter from 1 to 9.